Welcome in to another episode of the Barnes on Bama podcast. I'm your host, Owen Barnes, and we have a ton to discuss. Alabama Athletics has a full Saturday coming up with two huge matchups in basketball and football. We've got St. John's and Madison Square Garden at 11 Central, and then LSU at 6:30 Central here in Tuscaloosa. It's going to be a crazy weekend. I'm going to break down both games, talk about what you need to know for both games. We're going to give our predictions, then we're going to get out of here. We got a few little quick housekeeping things here we want to take care of up at the top. As always, if you are not currently subscribed to the channel, if you could do me a favor and subscribe, I would really appreciate it. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. I know about 89% of the people that have watched the content this year are not currently subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and subscribe, we would appreciate it. The other thing is if you're interested in any written content, I know for the written content, it's mostly been Alabama basketball, and that's probably going to be the case for now. But all that written content is posted on barnesonbama.com. That was where our pregame threads will lie, as well as on my Twitter accounts. If you are not currently subscribed or paying attention to over on barnesonbama.com, it's completely free. It's just a website that I put together that kind of holds these episodes as well as some of the written content. So go ahead and check that out if you have not already. As always, finally, we are sponsored by the Believe Podcast Networks. If you hear any ads on Apple or Spotify, that's because I am thankfully a part of that network. It's allowed me the opportunity to be a part of a lot of different collaboration streams. And I think we may have one upcoming for the Oklahoma game. But, I really appreciate that everything that they afford me the ability to do. So anything you could do to help out those people, we would appreciate. All right, we got a huge Saturday ahead of us, as I mentioned. Gonna break it down. We're gonna do the St. John's game first because that's the game that's gonna be happening first, and then we'll talk about the LSU game. Got a couple of thoughts on both games. We'll give our predictions, and then we'll get out of here. First things first, St. John's. St. John's coached by Rick Pitino. I think most of y'all probably should know that if you've paid attention in college basketball much. Uh, Alabama has played Rick Pitino twice while he was at Iona. They played once in the MTE tournament and then also in the uh, March Madness tournament, right? So they have played twice. It was a split 1-1. Alabama did lose the MTE, but win the March Madness tournament. His teams are known for being very good, right? He's known for being a very good defensive coach, especially at St. John's. If we look back at last season's team, obviously this team is much different. They do have some returning pieces, but when you look at what Rick Pitino has done from perspective, last season his team was 68th in offense and second in defense per KenPom. They did play pretty quickly, top 60 tempo. Definitely not going to play as fast as Alabama, but definitely play fairly quick. They do it from a forcing a lot of turnovers on defense, and that keeps the speed up, right? They're able to force you into turnovers, and that gets their offense up and running. Again, a top 25 steal percentage, top 10 in blocks, top 25 in both 3 point and 2 point percentage. They do a really good job. They didn't do a ton at running people off the 3 point line last year. They had about 41% of the shots go from three. Again, these numbers aren't going to be exact for this season, but I think it gives you a good baseline before we start talking about some of the things that you need to know that they've done this season. They've only had one game, but I think, especially with Zuby Ejiofor coming back, there are some things that you can kind of draw from this team. Again, they had about 41% of their shots from three that they allowed on the defensive side of the ball. They gave up about 55% assists, which is going to be a big deal because it's something that I think this Alabama team does a really good job, especially with the different ball handlers you have on the floor. I think that Alabama does a really good job at spreading the floor and assisting on made baskets. We had about 70% assists in that first game. And I think that St. John's potentially is going to gamble some. So if you're able to find the open man, I think that you will definitely have an opportunity to do so. But that's kind of what they were doing last season. From an offensive perspective, they were pretty poor shooting the three. They didn't take a ton of them. But the one place where they were dominant was on the offensive glass. They were eighth in the country. And that's something that where if you look back to the year before when Rick Pitino was at St. John's, they were fourth in the country in offensive rebounds. That's something that they have been very good at his entire time. And he's kind of been known for. So then that gets us to this year. And again, so far it's only one game stats. But so far this season, they played the 25th fastest pace. A lot of that's driven from your defense. Completely cool. They had 84 possessions. It was against Quinnipiac, so there's not a ton you can draw from that. But that is to be said that this game probably will be pretty fast paced, right? Alabama and Iona played some fairly fast tempos. And if I look back here at the last games that they played. Their game in the MTE versus Iona was a 75 possession game, and their game in the NCAA tournament was a 68 possession game. So the NCAA tournament, they definitely slowed it down a little more. Iona, he played a little faster. Also, that's partially due to the talent that he had at Iona. Obviously, a different level of talent that he's able to have at St. John's, and we'll talk about some of that talent here coming up soon. So that's just kind of your baseline. Additionally, when we're talking about this, some things that you kind of need to look at if you're talking about St. John's is, like I said, who he has on this year's team. And there's some really good players on this year's team. A huge number of those players did not play on this team last season, right? He has a fairly large transfer class, and they're from all over. Some from the Big East, some from just completely different conferences. So that's the big thing to note is like who is on this team. The biggest guy who is returning, we mentioned him earlier, is Zuby Ejiofor. Zuby Ejiofor is a guy who averaged almost 14 a game, or about 14, 15 a game last season. He had 17 in their first game. He is a huge dominant force down low at 6'9", almost 250. He is a guy who is a dominant force in the paint, right? He has been at St. John's for the last 3 seasons, or this is his third season. He started his career at Kansas, but he is a guy who has played at St. John's and for Rick Pitino for quite some time now. Additionally, you've got Dylan Mitchell that y'all may remember from Texas. He previously was at Cincinnati, but Alabama, should remember him from Texas when he was there. Additionally, you got a guy like Bryce Hopkins, which people might remember from his freshman season at Kentucky, but he most recently was at Providence. You got Ian Jackson that Alabama played last season when he was at North Carolina. This season, he's at St. John's. Jostin Sannon, that's a guy who Alabama wanted and definitely has gone after quite a few times at this point. He played for Patrick Murphy in AAU. He was previously at Arizona State, transferred to St. John's. Isaiah Sellers is a guy who transferred from USC/Stanford. His last season was Stanford, but he started his career at USC, right? So at the end of the day, Rick Pitino has really established part of his team this season out of a huge number of transfers. There are some other returners, Sadiku, um, Ibeen Ayo. I don't sorry if I mispronounced his name, but he's a guy who started with Rick Pitino at Iona, has been at St. John's with him now for the last 3 seasons. And is another, just presence in from a wing perspective, 6'6" guy that has played and knows Rick Pitino's system. You got Ruben Prey. We're just going through some of the names. We'll talk more specifics here in a second. And then you got Dylan Darling is the other transfer that's their transfer point guard, previously at Washington State and Idaho State, right? So what do all these names mean, right? We named off quite a few different names that are on the roster, but what is really the importance of this? One, this is an experienced team, right? Of the people that I listed, there's two sophomores in Sannon and Jackson. Everyone else in that listed roster is a junior or senior, right? So a ton of experience in college basketball. Very, very, very experienced team. Granted, very few of those people played at Iona for the majority of their time. Just 3 of them actually played on the team last season. So that is something to consider, right? The fact that only 3 of those guys played on the team last season. And again, when I'm talking about this, you're talking about the top 9 guys who played at Quinnipiac. Those are the ones that played over 10 minutes. Um, Similar to what Nate Oates did in the game for us, Rick Pitino played a huge number of people in that game against Quinnipiac. I don't expect that to be the case in the game in Madison Square Garden. Alabama and St. John's both will skinny their rosters in this game. I would not expect to see the same minutes rotation or the exact same rotation with starters, etc., for Alabama in this game. Now, one thing that we have not talked about yet from an Alabama perspective is who will be back. And when I say who will be back, if you watched our recap or saw the game, Alabama was missing 3 guys who we expected to play in that opening game that did not. You've got Latrell Wrightsell that was out with the finger injury, Aiden Holloway that was out with the wrist, and Keaton Bristow that was out with the ankle. I think that all 3 guys are gonna give it a go. Personally, I think if there was one that was a possibility to not give it a go of those 3, I think it's Keaton Bristow. which scares me a little bit because in that front line is a spot that I do think that Alabama's going to need some help. I think that's a spot that St. John's is going to have a bit of an advantage over Alabama potentially. You're going to need a big game out of Noah Williamson, a big game out of Aiden Sherrill in this one, going against Zuby, going against Dylan Mitchell, going against Bryce Hopkins. They're a fairly large front line. I think that in terms of Bryce Hopkins, I think that Alabama will have some wings that can potentially help. From a Dylan Mitchell and Zuby Ejiofor, I think that you are going to need some guys like Keaton Bristow, guys like Taylor Bolbowen to step up, and of course Noah and Aiden. I think you're going to need some big games out of those guys. But I do think that all three of those guys are going to play in this game. That's just my hunch, just my expectation. I think that Nate sat them out as a precautionary thing in game one to get them ready for that St. John's game because he knew that they had irritated things during practice, and he knew that if he could get him back for St. John's, that was a huge deal. And quite frankly, I think that Nate knew he could win without him. So I think that's the reason why that happened. Not that they weren't injured, but I think this is a standpoint of this was more of a precautionary sit out. Let's sit you out one game and see if we can get you back and ready for St. John's. Definitely would feel better if I knew for sure that Keaton Bristow was going to be ready to go 100%. But um, it happens. It's part of basketball, so we will have to see what happens when this game tips off. But needless to say, I do think that Alabama is going to have a little bit skinnier rotation. What that's going to look like with how good the freshmen have played, I would be very curious to see. That is something I'm going to be watching for in this game. Is what does Nate Oates' skinnier rotation look like? I would not suspect that we see a ton of Collins in this game. He's the one guy that I feel pretty confident you don't see a ton of. The only reason I think you see any of him is if Aiden or Noah get in serious foul trouble or just absolutely have an inability to guard Ejiofor at all. I think that, Nate potentially throws Collins out there for a short stretch to see if he can do anything. But realistically, I don't think that Collins plays a ton in this game. In terms of everyone else, I think that Nate probably plays them, but I am curious what the rotation looks like. I think that this is a game where St. John's is going to try to speed us up, and the ability to have multiple guys where LeBaron Fallon is not the only ball handler on the floor will be a very big deal. I thought that one of Alabama's issues in that North Dakota game was when LeBaron Fallon was off the floor, the ball handling ability dropped fairly substantially. The point guard position, the overall running the offense perspective dropped fairly substantially. Amari Allen was doing a decent job. Houston, in the moments he had it, was doing an okay job, but I still think that you need a guy like Aiden Holloway or Latrell Reitzel to run the point for the system and the speed that Nate Oates wants to run. Just twitchier, faster, better decision making. Really a propensity to get downhill. I think that that's something that you really need to see. Davion Hannah had a couple of turnovers trying to run a bit of point or just different things. And I think that that's something that Nate Oates will be trying to get those guys back for, right? So I think that that's going to be a very big deal in this game. Again, I do think that Aiden, Trelly, all those guys are going to be back for this game. But if they're not, it may change what I'm saying now. So just take that with a grain of salt. Because, of course, I am recording this on Wednesday evening and the game has not happened. We've not heard progress reports on all those guys. So I am recording this fairly early. But let's take that into our consideration. With this St. John's game, I think that what Alabama is going to have to do is number one, take care of the basketball. Again, we talked about St. John's using their pace because of speeding you up on defense, causing turnovers, getting blocks, etc. I think that Alabama needs to take care of the basketball first and foremost. Obviously, Natos is going to want to get out and run because getting out and run against a non-set defense is going to give you better help than if St. John's can get you in the half court. I completely agree with that standpoint. But I think that Alabama absolutely has to take care of the basketball and rebound the basketball. This is going to feel, in my mind, like a Houston game. This is going to be you have to be tough on the glass, you have to be tough with the basketball, and you have to finish around the rim. I think that that is a spot where Alabama is better this season already than they were last season. I think that a guy like Mark Sears sometimes hurt you at finishing around the rim through serious contact at times. Um, he was better than some others that Alabama's had. Like he's better than a Shackelford. He's better than JQ. where but Mark Sears sometimes had a propensity to get blocked, and that would worry me on occasion. I think LeBaron Philon, Aiden Holloway do a better job at not getting blocked, and I think that that's something that St. John's definitely has taken advantage of in years past and already seems to be taking advantage of this season, getting the block, getting the steal, and getting out and running. That is something we will need to see better on our side. Additionally, on the Alabama side, I think a place where you're gonna wanna watch this game is in the interior, right? Is an Aiden Sherrill, a Noah Williamson, a Keaton Bristow, a Taylor Bowen, right? I think it starts with those guys because Ejiofor and Dylan Mitchell are going to cause some issues if we let them keep going, right? If we don't establish position and establish the defense that we need against those guys and allow them to get into their position, it could be a situation like last season where Trey Kaufman-Renn just absolutely goes off and there's nothing we can do about it. Now, is it possible that that happens and Alabama is still able to shoot their way into, having this be a close game or even a win? Absolutely. I think that that's definitely possible, especially if St. John's is gambling at all. Alabama can find the open man and shoot their way out of it, sure. But I do think for the long-term success of this game, Alabama's going to need to be strong in the interior, and you're going to need big games out of guys like Keaton Bristow, Noah Williamson, Aiden Sherrill, Taylor Bowen. I think that those four guys are going to be a huge deal in this game just because of who St. John's has in that interior. And again, that's also going to get you ready for the next game that's against Oscar Clough and Trey Kaufman-Renn against Purdue, that you're going to have the same problem, right? You're going to need elite play out of the big men. Can you shoot your way, to keep it close? Absolutely. I think that Alabama is going to be one of the best shooting teams in the country this season. So can Alabama always shoot their way to keep it close? Yes. But there's a difference between keeping it close and actually, doing what it takes to win the game. And I think that at the end of the day, shooting can get you close, but you have to have the offensive rebounding. You have to have the ability to play defense to really be able to win the game against a team that's going to be as good as St. John's is going to be, right? So as much as I can say you can shoot well, sure, I think the offensive rebounding and defense in the interior is going to be a major thing because if they can, anytime they want it, go inside and score, that's going to be a problem, right? Additionally, they're just gonna be able to, burn down the clock, throw it inside, get the quick points, and Alabama won't be able to do much about it. So I think that that is one of the things that I'm gonna be watching for in this game. Additionally, I would be curious to see, how LeBaron Philon looks in this one. I think that, um Nate Oates has challenged him from a turnovers perspective. He had 5 in both of the exhibitions and had 4 in the last game. I think that, again, having guys like Aiden and Trelly back on the floor definitely will help Barron, but I am curious to see what he's able to do from a turnovers perspective because I think that St. John's is gonna give him some additional challenges. Obviously, we have played against Ian Jackson. With Coach Murphy, he knows a ton about Sandon, so we do know a good bit about the guys that we're gonna be playing against. However, it still is gonna be a situation where I am very curious to see what a guy like LeBaron Fallon does in this game. I think he shines in the brightest moments, so I think that a game in Madison Square Garden is perfect for LeBaron, which is part of the reason why I point him out. Obviously, he's your best player, but I still think that LeBaron shines in some of the brightest moments. And I do think that this game is gonna be a very big deal for him, and his ability to not turn over the basketball is gonna be something that's very important in this game. And then finally, I think that your ability to have your big guys and those 4 guys that we talked about be able to shoot the 3 at least to a level that causes Zuby and Dylan to come out from the interior, right? When you talk about what they were able to do, they only got 2 blocks in their first game, but again, these are guys that have had a ton of success blocking shots in the interior. Zuby Ejiofor, was top, he had about a 5% block rate last season. He had a 10% block rate the year before that. He's a guy that has blocked a ton of shots and is a part of what St. John's does on the defensive end of the floor. And if you can have guys like Aiden and guys like Noah step out and hit 1 3, what it at least does is it makes Zuby and Dylan have to step out to guard those guys. And if they have to step out to guard them, it's going to open up the lane. It's going to make the offense just flow better for everyone else. So I do think that that is going to be a major key in this game is if you can have your big front line that I think is going to have to play major defense, but if they can also give you just a little bit on the offensive perspective, especially from deep. I think that that additionally will just open up the game for Alabama's offense to flow in the half court. Obviously, Nate will want this game played not in the half court as much as possible, played in transition, played at a pace. But I think that St. John's defense is going to be good enough to get you into the half court at times. And if you can have some additional things to help speed, have some additional success in the half court, I think that's a very big deal. Again, I will do a full write up on all the people, in this game, their percentages, all the things you need to watch for in my pregame thread. I will, of course, have that written and I will put that out the Saturday morning before the game. Try to have it out as early as possible. May put it out Friday night so that people have time to read it. But just a heads up, that will be coming out. I have not written it yet, but I'll be working on that probably tomorrow so that I can have it out for either Friday evening or Saturday morning. So just go ahead and check over on barnesonbama.com. I'll also post it on Twitter if anybody is interested. I completely forgot to give my prediction for for the St. John's and Alabama game. For St. John's and Alabama, I do think that with this game being in Madison Square Garden, I think that it is going to be a game that Alabama is going to have to play some of their best to be able to win the game. I think that this is a game that's going to be in the mid to high 70s possessions range. I think somewhere between 75 and 78 possessions. I think that this is a game where it really comes down to, can Alabama take care of the basketball and what the defense in the interior looks like we've talked about. I think that those are your two keys to the game. I think that if you can have some defense in the interior and at least make it difficult for Zuby and Dylan, as well as rebound the basketball and take care of it, I think that Alabama should be able to have some success in this game. This is the type of game against like a Houston or somebody that Alabama has actually done decently well in. Alabama has had success against Houston. I think that that's a similar matchup to what you're going to get in this game. I think these teams are very similar in how good they are on defense and what they do. Different style of players, and obviously some differences with how Patino and Sampson do it. But I think that that's a similar matchup to what you're going to look like in this game. I do think that Alabama can win this game. I think that it will be, if we do win, however, I think that it will be very close. I think that this is a 3-point game one way or the other. I'm going to mark it as an Alabama win by a score of 87-84. Would it shock me if it was a St. John's win by a score of 87-84? No. But I think that that's kind of what you're looking like. I think that this is going to be a very good game and a very close game, whichever way it ends up going. But I think that this is going to be one where you're going to be on the edge of your seats from the start to finish. And it's going to be two very well coached teams, showing down in Madison Square Garden, the mecca of basketball. And I think that's kind of what you're going to have in this one. I think it's going to be a very good game, a very well coached game, and I think that's what you're looking like in this one. So that's my prediction for this game. I do think that that Alabama can win this one. I'm gonna give it a 3-point prediction for the win, but yeah, I don't know that it would truly shock me if it was 3 points one way or the other. So that's my prediction. Then we move to the game that's going to be happening on Saturday evening here in Tuscaloosa with Alabama taking on LSU. With Alabama taking on LSU, what you kind of need to know is, first and foremost, it's going to be a different LSU team. It's going to be an LSU team coached by Frank Wilson, not by Brian Kelly, as Brian Kelly was relieved of his duties immediately following the kind of blowout against Texas A&M in Baton Rouge. This is really just the second time that LSU had lost a night game in Tiger Stadium under Brian Kelly. The other loss was last season. Me and my fiance were in attendance for that one. Another blowout, right? His two losses in Death Valley at night were both blowout losses to Alabama and to Texas A&M. And if you're anybody not named LSU, I don't know that you lose your job. However, when you're talking about a program like LSU, you're talking about a program that has their last three coaches prior to Brian Kelly all won national titles in Nick Saban, Les Miles, and Ed Orgeron. And even Ed Orgeron won a title and then was not giving a super long leeway. Um, that's what that program kind of demands from an excellence perspective. They are in a state where they're the only, power conference program in that state. And it's a state with a crazy amount of talent. And I think that they understand that keeping that talent in state and staying at the top of the SEC is absolute paramount. But a big part of that is somebody that fully understands the culture of that state. And I think that that second point is the reason why Brian Kelly is no longer the coach. For as much as what he was able to do from a recruiting standpoint at times, right? He almost lands Bryce Underwood prior to Dave Portnoy and others, throwing a bunch of money and having him go to Michigan. They pretty much have him landed. Michigan comes in, throws the bag. There's not a whole lot you could do about it. But I think that by and large, he did an okay job recruiting that state. The big problem that Brian Kelly ran into is he almost cartoonized the state. Whether it was making up the fake Southern accent, whether it was the horrific recruiting videos, just whatever he was doing, it to a degree felt like he was not giving it the passion that that state requires and deserves. If you listen to Josh Pate at all, he talked about, Brian Kelly being, not being as involved in certain recruiting things and just like certain things that happened where it didn't feel like he was giving it the due that it deserves, so to speak. And I think that a big thing that you have to look at when you're talking about that LSU job is I am of the mindset, even as an Alabama fan, that that is a top job in the country, if not number one. The fact that that program is willing to spend the amount of money that they are, the fact that the stadium is what it is, the fans are what they are, the fact that you're in the SEC, but mostly, again, the fact that you're in a state with the amount of talent that they have from a football perspective, and you're the only Power 5 school. The value in having in the state of Alabama, having guys that grow up being Alabama fans and then coming to Alabama is a big deal. When you have guys in Louisiana, if they grow up as LSU fans and then they have an elite program that they can go to in LSU, that's a big deal. But if they grow up an LSU fan and all of a sudden it's a terrible program, those kids are, possible and willing to go to a Georgia or an Alabama or an Auburn or a Florida, right? They're willing to go to some of these other states because they want to win. And I think that that's what you're looking for when you're looking for a head coach for that state is you're looking for somebody that understands what the talent, has at their disposal, but additionally you're looking for somebody that can galvanize the program. And so that's why if you're going to ask me, I actually think because of what Brian Kelly did, and when you look at Brian Kelly did a couple of things. First things first, he fired the strength and conditioning coach, Tommy Moffitt. By firing the strength and conditioning coach, Brian Kelly's mindset is I'm bringing in my own guy. However, Tommy Moffitt was with both three other coaches that won national titles. This was a situation where he was part of the reason I can say this with a certainty why they won the national title. When you think about what a strength and conditioning program does, it yes helps you, get stronger, but it additionally helps you with your stamina late in games. What did Texas A&M do in that game? They absolutely dominated them in the second half. That's strength and conditioning. It's kind of a situation that sets the baseline for how good your program can be. If your strength and conditioning is not at the level of everyone else, then you will not compete at the level of everyone else. And firing the guy that got you to the point that they were at, having him go to A&M and then use it against you in Tiger Stadium was a bridge too far. And I think that that's something that Brian Kelly just did not understand. Additionally, I am of the mindset that there were players, and I don't know if it's the majority, but that there were players that were playing despite Brian Kelly, not because of Brian Kelly. And when I say despite Brian Kelly, not because of Brian Kelly, what I mean by that is I think that there were situations where Brian Kelly was the head coach and they were playing for the name of LSU, but not exactly playing for Brian Kelly. it seemed to me that there were too many people after he got fired that weren't upset that he got fired, right? It seemed to me that, like, it almost was like "Oh, what goes around comes around." You had it coming, right? It, to me, felt that way. And when you see something like that, right? When you combine that with the fact that LSU has supreme talent, they have an elite roster. I think that you were in for a potential situation where the LSU team that you face on Saturday is a better LSU team than you would have faced if Brian Kelly was the head coach. Because I think that there was a at least partial position of LSU, whether it was staffers or coaches or um, players that were playing despite of Brian Kelly. A- And I think that it almost felt like Brian Kelly was getting ready to scapegoat, whether it was his offensive coordinator or whatever, and was going to save his own job despite someone else's. And I think that now you're going to have a team that's really playing for let's be the best LSU we can be because we don't feel like if we're the best LSU we can be, we're just saving some guy's job that we don't particularly like. Again, that is an outsider's perspective, but I feel like that's what I have. Additionally, I think there's some data to back that up. I think that when you see the Arkansas team and the Florida team, what they looked like in their next game following the firing of their head coach, not that Sam Pittman and Billy Napier were in the same position and some of the same things that we're talking about with Brian Kelly, but I still do think that you had a better position where those teams played better the next game after the firing of their coach. Of course, you even have the UCLA firing where UCLA looks terrible with their head coach, and you fire him, you bring in a new head coach and new offensive coordinator, and all of a sudden UCLA starts winning games. Um, Again, there's plenty of instances where this happens, and I think that it partially depends on why the person was fired as to if that happens or if it doesn't. Also, who takes over in the interim, who your coordinators are. I think there's a lot of factors, but I honestly do believe that this is a situation where LSU will be a better version of LSU without Brian Kelly than with him. I honestly believe that. I think additionally, the fact that you fired him with an off week helps. I think that that gives you a little bit extra time for the interim to get um, accustomed, so to speak, before the next game. So I do think that this is going to be a game where Alabama cannot take it lightly. Because I think that LSU again has supreme talent on this roster when you look at this season, um, again, they don't have any massive wins. That Clemson win early in the season does not look nearly as good as it did early in the season. Florida, of course, that win does not look that crazy given the fact that they don't have a head coach currently either. They had a decent game against Ole Miss. I guess you can take something from that. The fact that it was just a 5 point game. Um, they had a 7 point game against Vandy, but again, the win over South Carolina is not something you can take a ton from. This is a situation where LSU has not really proven a ton this season. But again, they have an elite roster and they have a team that is capable of doing things better than what their record looks like. So, who are those players? I think when you talk about LSU, you have to start first and foremost with Garrett Nussmeier. Garrett Nussmeier is a gunslinger. He's somebody that, with his potential injury of his pec, he has had a little bit different throwing motions and not quite as successful as he was last season. He was a guy that I think most people coming into this season expected to have a huge, huge year. He has not been quite the guy that most people had expected from that standpoint. However, he has still been a very good quarterback. He has 1,800 passing yards, 65% completion percentage, 12 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, has taken 14 sacks. This is a standpoint where again, he's a very good quarterback and he definitely can make a lot of the throws on the field. He is somebody that Alabama will, try to get into his head and mix up pictures and such and make him beat you. I fully expect Alabama to play a ton of zone like we have this season and really just make him walk the ball down the field and almost try to bait him into some of the bomb it deep throws. You saw that against Tennessee, where we made Joey Aguilar just keep trying to pick it and pick it and pick it down the field where you just have to take the 5 yards. And eventually, those quarterbacks that are more gunslinger type quarterbacks sometimes try to go for the deep ball, and it doesn't work out for them. So I think that that is something that I would expect that Alabama to do to do in this game. I think that Alabama's going to play a ton of zone and kind of force LSU to walk that ball down the field. Their number one receiver from a yards perspective has been Aaron Anderson, a guy who Alabama fans should know a ton about. He previously obviously played at Alabama under Nick Saban. You've also got guys in Barry and Brown and Xavier Thomas, that have been good receivers. Trey'Dez Green is their tight end that has 260 yards receiving, and Bauer Sharp has 190 yards receiving as a tight end. So they have some decent receiving threats at the tight end position. Those are more really touchdown threats, with Green having 4 touchdowns leading the team from that perspective. These are guys that, again, they have plenty of skill talent guys. This is LSU. This is not going to be a dead roster, even though they have not won some games and have not been as impressive as they could be. This is not a dead roster. This is somebody that really knows what they're doing. Um, from a running perspective, they got Caden Durham and Harlan Berry, kind of the two-headed attack that has almost 400 yards and 220 yards rushing. They're averaging about 5 yards a carry. They each have 2 touchdowns. Juwan Johnson, their backup quarterback, I guess, is right. He's officially listed as a quarterback, but it looks like he mostly just does running on the team. He's got 2 touchdowns as well. Again, this is a team that is going to have some success, and has a really good team. Right at the end of the day, this is not a barren roster. That's the thing that I want to make sure everyone is aware of. This roster is not what their record looks like. This is LSU after all. Then when you're talking about what they've kind of done from a defensive perspective, I think the thing that they did the best, is against quarterbacks that did not have their best stuff. And I'm specifically looking at a team like Florida. They get 5 interceptions against Florida. Obviously, I do not think that Ty Simpson is going to put the ball in harm's way as much as they did. However, the point that I make with this is LSU has guys who are definitely willing to make the play and able to make the play, from a defensive perspective, right? They've got 3 guys with 2 interceptions. They got 4 others with one. This is a team that is built to have the turnover, whether it's corners, safeties, linebackers. Like, you got Harold Perkins still on this team. He currently leads the team, or tied for the lead for the team in sacks, with Shanklin. They have not had a ton of sacks this season, which is something that, LSU, it usually has that one elite pass rusher that you really expect to see. I think that's one thing that you're going to see differently in this LSU game that you didn't see in the last couple. I mean, they have 17 sacks as a team, but they've only got 2 guys with 2 sacks. Everybody else has a sack and a half or less. I think that that is something where it's kind of a mixed bag, right? There's one thing where, yes, they're still getting to the quarterback with 17 sacks. However, the fact that you don't have that one elite pass rush guy, um, it sometimes means that you're going to have to get more exotic with your blitzes to be able to get to the quarterback, and against a guy like Ty Simpson that's been able to pick up the blitz and play under pressure so well, that's something that would scare me if I'm an LSU fan. I think that, if you have that dominant pass rusher like Alabama played against Missouri or Tennessee or South Carolina, they just allow you to do a little bit more in the back end because you're not having to bring the additional pressure to get to the quarterback. So that's the one thing that I would say from a defensive perspective is this team has caused a lot of turnovers. Again, a lot of those were against Florida. So take that with whatever you need it to be. But I do think that from a perspective of getting to the quarterback, they have done a decent job at getting the quarterback. They just haven't done it with a single person consistently where they feel confident that one guy is going to win. Obviously, Alabama had some struggles with this at times. You've had a guy like Yonze Pierre that's really stepped up and been a huge deal in that game, in that standpoint, has done a huge step forward and has been that pass rusher that you need him to be. But LSU currently doesn't have that guy. Obviously, Harold Perkins has been that guy in years past at times, but again, he has 2 sacks this season. He is not having the All American season that some people may have expected. Additionally, Whit Weeks is potentially going to be missing in this game. They considered him doubtful a couple of days ago. And if he is missing in this game, he is the leader of their defense and he calls all the plays and he's been out a couple of games, so this won't be the first game that he's missing, but they have not been the same defense without him. I know that Clint Lamb posted some of the stats of what their yards given up with him and without him was. It's a little, and Clint even said it was a little unfair, but even when you look at what he's the games he was there versus the games he wasn't at SEC competition, it still is clearly a difference, right? What Weeks is a major player on this team, and not having him will be a problem, right? I think the LSU is a team that has skill talent, absolutely, has defensive talent, absolutely, but their defense is definitely not the strongest part of their game. Most people would consider their offense to be the stronger part of their game, and when you combine all of that with the fact that I think that Alabama has a secondary and a defensive scheme this year that is built to play against a guy like Garrett Nussmeier, I think that Alabama's gonna have a lot of success in this game. I think that Alabama wins this game. I think that Alabama wins it, eventually fairly handily, but I do think that this is going to be a game where in the first half, LSU gives you more than you potentially had bargained for. I think this is a game where it's very, very close for the beginning of this game, and then Alabama pulls away later in this game. I think Alabama eventually wins by maybe 17. So I'm looking at like a 34-17 type win. But I do think that Alabama is the better team, of course. But again, I think that this LSU roster has more talent than some people are going to give them credit for because of the losses, because of the fired coach. Don't look at the fired coach as an absolutely lost season. Look at the fired coach as Brian Kelly was not right for this job. Because at the end of the day, this is still an LSU team that still has a ton of talent and still has an ability to beat teams, but they had Brian Kelly at the helm and it was not helping them, right? By not helping them, he was hurting them, and that's why they got rid of Brian Kelly. So that's the thing that you need to really look at when you're talking about this team and kind of what you're looking at for this Alabama LSU game. I think it'll be a very good game. I think that Alabama should win this game, but again, I think that will be very good into the second half. That's my prediction. We're gonna go 34-17 for the St. John's Alabama game. We're gonna go 87-84. Again, as I mentioned, thank you so much everyone for all the support. If you are not currently subscribed to the channel, if you could do so, I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much everyone for watching, and I will catch you in the next episode. Peace.